So good evening, and thank you for coming this evening. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Glad that we had we had a little difficulty with the computer, but fortunately we are in a library that has more than one computer, so that really worked out well. Thank you for coming this evening on a very unusual April 16th evening, to say the least. I think Beth wondered when we saw the snow flying today whether or not we'd have some brave souls to come, and we do, so thank you very, very much. Let's review a little bit about what we ended with in March when we had our first session. So when we talked about Michigan history, we covered the first peoples in Michigan. We looked at the Paleolithic and the Archaic and the Woodland Indians and Native Americans. We looked at the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, and we'll be talking a little bit more about them later on today. We looked at the French coming to Michigan and the impact of what the French did and what the French focused on. And we looked about the fact that the French concentrated their main focus on the fur industry. So they never really saw themselves as permanent, at least in the Northwest, because they wanted to get in, get whatever they could for the money, and then move on. They did have those permanent settlements along the St. Lawrence River and the towns that we now know, of course, Quebec and Montreal. Then we had someone named Cadillac, who had a different idea. And that was, of course, to make a permanent settlement in the Northwest in a city that we know as Detroit in 1701. So we looked at that. We also covered a little bit about the British coming over. We spent very little time on the French and Indian War because remember, when you look at the French and Indian War, there was very little of that happened in Michigan. In fact, practically nothing. But the impact of that war on Michigan was that we went from French control to British control. And they took over Michigan in 1760, diplomatically in 1763 after the Treaty of Paris. We looked at that, and then we looked a little bit about the American Revolution, and where we ended it last month. So we looked at the American Revolution, obviously some of the impacts that it had on Michigan, which included, of course, we talked about Niles, Michigan, and Fort St. Joseph, and how they became the city of Four Flags. We looked at the removal of the fort at Mackinac City, transferring that to the island, Mackinac Island, where they built the fort there, which is still there. And then the impact of Detroit reinforcing their garrison around there. So that's really where we ended it. And where we ended it last month was at this slide. Before we get going, though, this evening, I do want to sort of bring to your attention, I have books. I have lots of books. And when you teach something like this for 15 years, you collect a lot of books. And if anything, no, I did not bring these books to give out. These are not going to be door prizes, I can assure you this. I treasure my Michigan history books. But I wanted to bring attention, if you're interested, to sort of cover what we talked about during the first part in March. One of the best books that I have read so far that talk about the Native Americans in Michigan is called The Rites of Conquest. This is by Charles Cleland. And the subtitle of this book is The History and Culture of Michigan's Native Americans. It covers the three main groups that we looked at, which were considered, remember, they called the period from 1600 on historic because we've got so many written records about them. And this one was a really, really good book. So, Rites of Conquest, The History and Culture of Michigan's Native Americans by Charles Cleland. When you look at textbooks in Michigan history, it's really interesting to see how different books have been written through the years. And I have to say that in the last probably 40 plus years, the mother of all textbooks, you might be familiar with, Michigan, A History of the Great Lakes State by Dr. Willis Dunbar. And if that name sounds familiar, if you're familiar with either Kalamazoo College or Western Michigan University history, you know of Dr. Dunbar. He has a hall named after him on Western's campus. Had a very interesting career, was born in Hartford, taught school, came to Kalamazoo, as I said, was at K College, got involved with broadcasting for WKZO television and radio, and later then came on to the faculty of Western. Well, he wrote this, his first version came out in the mid-1960s, and he was asked to write a textbook for a high school level class. Well, this is a lot for high school. So there are a lot of college classes that have used this book. I started out using this for several years because it is so chock full of information. It has just about everything that you would expect to know up to a point. Although it's interesting when you look at this, being a book of the mid-1960s, unfortunately, Dr. Dunbar has very little information in here about the Native Americans. There's only about 4 or 5 pages, and a lot of that reflects the information that was out there at that time that he could get a hold of. I stepped away from this one because for an undergraduate college introductory class, it was a little bit too much for them to digest. And there have been some others that have come up. Now, one that I used, and I don't know if they really appreciated the writing. If you've ever read Bruce Catton, that man had a way to go around a word. Just a beautiful, beautiful writer. And this was a book that came out in 1976 for the bicentennial. It was funded by American Association for State and Local History. And I don't know how many of the states that books were written about them, but this one I used in a class, I used for several semesters, and it was okay, but he only takes it up to the 20th century, and he ends right before the automobile era. But just beautifully, beautifully written.
What's the title?
This is Michigan, a Bicentennial History. Not very long, and just, again, big fan of Bruce Catton's writing. The one that I adopted in 2014, and for those of you that, when you talk about adoption and teaching whatever, I taught Michigan history for 15 years, between 2002 and 2017, but we won't go any further than that. In 2014, Roger Rosentreater, who was the editor of the Michigan History magazine for many, many years, came out with Michigan, a history of explorers, entrepreneurs, and everyday people. And this one I really had some very good luck with. I think he has some really good information on Native Americans, sort of mirrors what we talked about last month. Talks a lot about Michigan in the 19th century. The one problem with the book is that when it comes to the post-World War II era, it sort of falls short. And he's got a couple chapters in here about who were the who's who of Michigan political life. So that I think, and it's a little hard to sort of, when you get into that period of Michigan history, to know exactly what you want to cover. But this right here, if you're interested, I can share with you, if we have enough time, how you can access this book electronically through Western's library, if you're interested in this. So this one has been really, really good. Another book that I'm going to refer to later on this evening, I will refer to when we get to that point. Okay. And yes, I have many, many more. Okay. So let's go at hand. Let's look at what we're going to cover today. Now, if all goes well, and I'm so glad that Beth has that. I know Beth made arrangements for that, but no, it was in the design of the building. That wonderful clock up there that's lit, so I can keep track of my time, because I know that pretty soon, not now, we've got some time, but if I don't watch it, Beth is going to get the hook and sort of pull me off, because I've talked too long. We want to make sure that we get out of here before you start hearing. You have 6 minutes left to be in the library. It's been a while since I have worked at this time, so I don't know what kind of warnings they get. So let's get at hand. Now, I talked about, I had thought that we were going to get into the territorial period, but we actually got a lot further last month than what I thought we were going to. So I'm not going to make any promises as where we're going to get to tonight, whether or not we get to statehood, which will be, really great. Hey, we became a state. Did you know that? Yeah. So we'll do that, but we'll see what we're going to do. Okay, so where we left off last month, we talked about Michigan after the American Revolution. The Treaty of Paris, which was the formal diplomatic treaty that ended the war between the United States and Great Britain. But by that time, we know that hostilities had ceased after the Battle of Yorktown in 1781. The one thing with the territory in the Northwest is that we know this part right here. Even though they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Great Britain was not going to leave any of these forts, especially the forts in the Northwest, specifically the ones that we know of, Detroit and Mackinac City. Now, one begins to wonder, did they not want to leave because of the cuisine? They just loved those pasties so much they didn't want to leave up north? Well, probably not, because they probably didn't have pasties back then. Was it the climate that they wanted to take advantage of because they loved spring in Michigan? No, it was a very simple reason. Great Britain, well, no, two reasons. Great Britain still wanted to take advantage of, what do you think?
Furs.
The furs. They still wanted to take advantage of the fur trade. And most importantly, when you look at this period of American history, there was no army to kick them out. Because when you look at the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles of Confederation, if you remember your American history, were ratified in March of 1781, so 2 years before the Treaty of Paris, by the Confederation Congress or the Congress of the Confederation. And if you remember your American history in the Articles of Confederation, you remember that there were things that the government could do and things that the government could not do. So, the Confederation Congress could declare war, sign treaties, borrow and print money, regulate Indian affairs, establish postal service, and carry on foreign affairs, to just mention a few. The Confederation Congress, though, could not levy taxes. They could not regulate commerce, which means, how can you raise an army if you have no money to pay them? So with Great Britain, number one, they didn't want to leave because they wanted to, again, keep making money off the fur trade. But the other thing, too, who was going to be there to tell them to leave? Certainly not the Army of the Confederation. So here we have, again, a repeat of what they could do. Well, one of the things that the Confederation Congress did do is they needed to have the states who claimed ownership of this area, especially the Northwest, to give up their claims. Now, if you, years ago, when so many of these areas like Virginia, like Massachusetts, like Connecticut, when they received their royal charters from the king as far as, you were going to be able to start this colony, they talked about how far the boundaries of those colonies were going to be. So this is the kind of map that you see here when you've got right here, Massachusetts claimed this, Virginia claimed most of Wisconsin, Connecticut claimed here, and you can see here the different other colonies, later on states, and what they felt that they owed. But by 1786, 3 years after that Treaty of Paris, they gave up those claims. It was also around that time period, or even a little before, that the Confederation Congress decided that the western lands would be treated, the western lands that we see here, would be treated not as colonies, but as distinctive republican states. What we will cover now is a series of ordinances that were passed in some way to do something about this land. So even though the Congress does not have control of this land, they are still putting in plans for how they're going to regulate, how they're going to administer, how they're going to, get anything from them. And the reason why they pass them as ordinances rather than as amendments is because then they would not have to go to the states for ratification. And if you had to go to the states for ratification, you were going to need a unanimous vote. So it was easier for them to pass these as ordinances. Well, let's look at the first one. The Land Ordinance of 1784 was spearheaded by Thomas Jefferson. And it was his idea of how that land should be regulated. And so there are a few things here. Now, keep in mind that he's talking about the land north of the Ohio River, west of the Appalachian Mountains, and east of the Mississippi River. So what we now would know of as the Old Northwest. So he had some quite adventurous ideas because he saw this being divided into 10 states. He also established some things that then were carried over. One of the things was he said that the land needed to be purchased by the Native Americans, and he established the process of how they wanted to be a state. And then, of course, he also says here, and this is something that carried over in the next succeeding years with other ordinances, is that any new state that would be created specifically in that Old Northwest would still be on equal par with the other established states. Well, it's interesting because I think this is at the William Clements Library. This actually was found in the Michigan History magazine. Here's a map of the way that Thomas Jefferson thought that this land should be divided up. So here you've got the Ohio River right here. He doesn't quite have 10 states north of the Ohio River, but you can see that Michigan actually would have been divided into number 3 and number 5. And he had some very interesting names. Illinois, Washington, well, I mean, that's a given, Washington. Everything was named Washington back then. Cherronosius, Asasaspia, I don't know. My pronunciation is horrible, and Michigania. Now, I think that's really interesting, that one of the names of his states that he suggested was Michigania. Congress felt that the states were way too small, that he wanted to make. And they also felt that the population requirements were too low, and so this really didn't proceed anywhere. But what was interesting about this is it did establish some principles that then were carried on after that. I really get geeked on this stuff. I love these ordinances. It's really weird. I read a book on one over the summer. Everybody thought, or during summer vacation, people thought it was like, come on. So the Land Ordinance of 1785. That one came the next year, and one of the reasons why this came, most importantly, is they needed a way to bring money into the Treasury. Remember, they can't levy taxes, they can't regulate commerce, but maybe if they start selling this land, they'll get some income in here. So the Land Ordinance of 1785, as it says here, how to divide and sell the land. And specifically what we're looking at is the Northwest, because if you go down south, Tennessee becomes a state in 1795. So that land down in the southeast is beginning to get settled, and they are beginning to become states already. But this specifically, originally, dealt with that land, again, north of the Ohio River, and east of the Mississippi, and west of the Appalachians. Again, they stated that the land was to be purchased first by the Native Americans. And we'll get into that as far as, again, the fairness of that. That's a whole nother lecture in itself. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 stated how the land would be, of course, the first thing would be it would be surveyed, how it would be divided, and they went with the township. And we'll talk about that in a little bit, why they went for the township. So it talked, and we'll illustrate this by looking at a plat map of Kalamazoo County, so you get the idea. So township 6 miles square. Each of the townships would be divided into 36 sections, and you can see here 640 acres. And you can see that initially you had to buy a minimum of 640 acres at $1 each, or $1 per acre, $1 per acre. So you can only imagine then who are the kind of people who can afford something like that. Because you're looking at a situation where, I mean, I don't know what the salary was at that time, the yearly income at that time, but it certainly for the most people, for the majority of the people, wasn't 640. I will say though that, okay, so this was in 1785. Over the years though, between 1785 and 1820, the number of minimum acres diminished. So it went from 640, it went to 320, 160, and 80 acres was a minimum purchase. But that was over a 40-year time period before that happened. This last part was really interesting because for the first time, we are now creating some form of government support of education. So the sale of 16 would go for the schools, and originally it would go to the township. Now this didn't mean that the school had to be located on Section 16, but what it meant that when Section 16 sold, that money then would go to the township to support schools. And that's something very, very different. Okay, so here is a wonderful plat map of Kalamazoo County. This is 1873. So when you look at, for example, Alamo Township, I mean, this is a perfect illustration of this because the shape of Kalamazoo County matches so well from what you're talking about it. So Alamo Township is 6 miles square, and you can see that the sections are divided up as far as that. So if you look at any of the townships in Kalamazoo County, 6 miles square, and within that, you've got 36 sections of 640 acres each. So there you have it. And this is 1873. All right. All right, so, well, let's go back to this one before I get to that. So they thought, this is great. We've now established how this land is going to be divided and sold, and we'll have all this money that will be pouring into the treasury of the Confederation Congress, and wouldn't that be great? Land sales were slow. There were companies that were created. There were a group of Virginia residents that formed what was called the Ohio Company, and they purchased 1.5 million acres in Ohio, and then they would market it to individuals to come. But they were having a little bit of a challenge to get people to buy property, and this, of course, was in Ohio. Now, who they wanted to appeal to specifically, and we'll talk about this a little bit later this evening, is they specifically wanted to appeal to people from New England. And Manassas Cutler, who was one of the leaders of the Ohio Company, wanted to attract men of robust constitutions, inured of labor, and free of habits and idleness. And that was one of the characteristics, according to him, of people from New England. The thing that they were finding, though, is it's one thing to have established how the land is going to be divided and sold. What people wanted was governing. How is this land going to be governed? What is the process for us to become a state? And so the Confederation Congress in the fall of 1786 formed a committee, and what they wrote is the second big one, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So you can see here that not only did it deal with how to govern it, it was definitely more specific than that one 3 years earlier that was endorsed by Thomas Jefferson. And again, though, they did say, though, that new states coming in will be just on the same level as the other states. So let's go through this quickly, and I want you to pay attention to this, because this is really going to be very appropriate when we talk about statehood and Michigan's march towards statehood. Okay, so it established this territory, and I want you to key in on this right here. So instead of 10 states, no less than 3, no more than 5. At this point in 1787, they didn't know how many states there were going to be. I mean, Ohio was really growing, but they didn't know how many. So they said no less than 3, no more than 5. The boundary line is what is interesting. Now, the boundary line, some of that is given. The Ohio River to the south, yeah, that's a natural boundary. Canada to the north, well, I think the Canadians would appreciate that. Pennsylvania to the east, and Mississippi to the west. Okay, so that's the general boundaries. This is what is interesting. The southern boundary for the northern states would be the southern border of Lake Michigan. Okay, so remember that, because that's going to keep coming up, okay? So the southern boundary of the northern states was going to be the tip, the southern tip of Lake Michigan, okay? All right, so this is where it gets interesting, because, so here you have, okay, the boundary of, so you have the tip of Lake Michigan here, and if you draw the southern boundary of what becomes Michigan, you get the idea of where the Toledo Strip would have landed, according to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Okay? All right. The other thing that this did is it established, one of the second thing, the number 2 big thing it did was establish that process. So you can see that in the first stage, you have 5 people who are going to govern your territory. These are all appointed by the President of the United States. So there's no representative government whatsoever. What was also interesting is that they had varying terms, and all of these 5 individuals also had to own land in the territory. So not only are they owning land outside the territory, but they have to own land in the territory. So for example, the territorial governor had to own 1,000 acres in the territory. So at $1 an acre, you can imagine the kinds of individuals that we're dealing with here that get these posts for this. So they all had their responsibilities. They were all supposed to create laws for the territories, but they were not supposed to create unique laws. They were supposed to create laws that they had adopted from other places. So you had that. Now, second stage, if you have 5,000, now when we say 5,000, we're talking about 5,000 free adult males of legal voting age, which at that, of course, time was 21, you could go to the second step. And there you have some level of representation. So what do? You get to vote for what we would call like a house of representatives, like a state house. And they had rules as far as how many representatives that you would get. Then you would also have another body, so you had a bicameral legislature, and that the General Assembly, or the House, would nominate so many men to the Congress who would then appoint what's called the Legislative Council. And the Legislative Council, at that point in time, had like 5 members. That sort of number sort of varied. So you had a sort of a bicameral legislature there. But it's interesting that at this time, property ownership was paramount and important, and you could not vote unless you owned property. So if you were a voter, you had to own 50 acres. If you were a representative, you had to own, for example, in Legislative Council, you had to own 500 acres. So land ownership was very important for representative democracy at that time. Now, you could choose a delegate to the Congress, but while you're a territory, they're not going to be able to vote. And the reason why property ownership was so important is that they really felt that this was necessary for a Republican government. That the people needed to have a stake, and according to them, to have a stake, you have to own property. That, of course, changed through the years. Okay. The third stage, right here, if you had 60,000 people, now this means total, not free adult males who can vote, but 60,000 total, you could go to the U.S. Congress and say, could we please write a constitution? You write a constitution, they say, go ahead, you become a state. So, talked about the Northwest Ordinance, established the no less than 3, no more than 5, established this process to become a state. And the other thing that's really interesting about the Northwest Ordinance in 1787 is that it established a certain level of rights that were to be guaranteed to the people who were living in these territories. So you can see here that they dealt with not only freedom of religion, but also, too, a number of legal rights that weren't even guaranteed to the people living in those other states along the eastern seaboard. Keep in mind that when this is happening in 1787, we do have the Constitution that is being written in Philadelphia. But remember that the Bill of Rights did not come till later. That wasn't in the Constitution. So I've always found it interesting how they were guaranteeing these things to the people in the territories in 1787 before they were guaranteed to the people who were living in those 13 original states. So, interesting. Let's go back here a second. Some of the other things that they did in the Northwest Ordinance, there was an article that prohibited slavery. We did talk about slavery last week in Michigan during the French period and also the British period. Unfortunately, with the Northwest Ordinance, people who were slaves who were already here were grandfathered in. So even though the Northwest Ordinance talked about the elimination of slavery or prohibiting slavery, it did nothing about the people who were already slaves here. There was also a statement about the treatment of Native Americans, and there was also things about education. Okay, so the Northwest Ordinance 1787. So meanwhile, what's happening on the national front? Well, once the federal government came in with George Washington, there were challenges that they had to deal with. One of the things that they wanted to confront was, again, the control of the forts. That was solved by a couple things. One of the things was Jay's Treaty in 1794, which turned over the ownership of the forts, and I think really one of the overriding reasons for that is because of the French Revolution. Great Britain's focus was in other places, not in those forts in the Northwest. Maybe the fur trade also wasn't that lucrative at that time. I'm not really too sure. So they left by 1796. The other thing we did have, because of the amount of settlers that were coming into Ohio, there was a level of Native American unrest in Ohio, specifically, and also in Indiana. Here we have one of the first confrontations between an American force, because of course now that we are a federal government, the federal government can have a standing army, and there were a number of generals who were in charge of that. The one that had the most success is this guy right here, Anthony Wayne, who fought in the American Revolution, was known as Mad Anthony Wayne, and has quite a number of things named for him over in the southeastern part of Michigan. He's got Wayne County, Wayne State University, Wayne Community College, among many other things around in there. The unrest culminated in what was called the Battle of Fallen Timbers, which happened around the Maumee River, Toledo, Ohio area, and resulted in one of the first treaties between the Native Americans of the Northwest and the American government. And so here we begin the pattern of Native American secession of their land. So this happened in 1795. In this you can see what the American government acquired at that time period and what the Native Americans received. This is where we get into the idea of annuities. Native Americans were promised annuities, and again, we'll get into that a little bit as far as how successful things were. 1795, though, is the beginning of the treaties between the federal government and the Native Americans as far as the land goes in the Northwest. Okay. So, what you see here is a series of maps that show the transition of the Northwest. So what we have up here, we have the total Northwest Territory, including what we know now as the 5 major states, and also it's got a little bit of Minnesota up there. You can see later on, you have a division between Indiana and Northwest. Once Ohio becomes a state here, you've got a state and a territory. You can see that in 1805, Michigan becomes a territory. When Michigan became a territory in 1805, what I want you to notice, though, what I want you to notice with this is that, yes, it's the lower peninsula, and it's a little bit of the tip of the upper peninsula, mainly where Sault Ste. Marie is located, and also St. Ignace. So that's what the Michigan Territory was between 1805 and approximately 1837 when we became a state. So if you want to trip up some students, ask them when Michigan becomes a state, they get the entire upper peninsula. And they're wrong, because we already had a portion of that upper peninsula. So here's the Michigan Territory in 1805. Okay. When we became a territory, and I should backtrack just a second. I'm not going to backtrack as far as the slides go, but let me just backtrack a second. And that when the Americans took over the Northwest in 1796, they were in Detroit. They took control of the fort in Detroit, and they also took control of the fort up at Mackinac on the island. And there was also a very small settlement in what was called Frenchtown. You may know it as Monroe, Michigan. So those were really the 3 areas of concentration of population at the time. So in 1805, we become a territory, and like with most territories, we have 5 individuals who get appointed to govern the territory. And we have Governor William Hall, who was from Connecticut. He had gone to Yale. He fought in the American Revolution. He was a lawyer, justice of the peace, and state senator. Of course, it was said that he had very little knowledge of the frontier and did not know the French language. And the majority of the people at this time in Michigan spoke French. So I think you would see the same pattern with many of them. One of the more interesting individuals, William Hall, yes, very, very interesting. We'll see a role that he plays in American history with Michigan, is this guy right here, Augustus Woodward. Augustus Woodward lived in New York and Philadelphia, attended Columbia, worked in the Treasury Department, spoke 4 languages, and had a big impact on the Detroit area. And yes, I do believe has a very long road named after him. Here are some pictures I've been able to dig up. Here's William Hall. Here's Augustus Woodward. And they always make that nose a very prominent feature of Augustus Woodward. And then this is another one. This is Frederick Bates, who came from Virginia. He was a lawyer and had been in the Army. And so those were the people who were in charge. Well, when they took over, unfortunately, one of the things that they first had to confront was the burning of Detroit. It was a fire that started in June 11th of 1805, not long after we became the territory. Now, what's interesting about that is that when you look at the flag of the city of Detroit, the flag was actually created in 1907. It was adopted about 40 years later. One of the things it does, like what Niles does with the city of 4 flags, is that in Detroit, they commemorate the countries that have controlled the city over the years. So you've got symbols from France down here, you've got symbols from Great Britain, and then you've got symbols from the United States. Now the figures in the middle relate to the fire that happened in June of 1805. You've got a woman on the left who is weeping over the destruction of the city, and then you have the woman on the right who is consoling her and gesturing that a new city will rise in its place. I will not pronounce the Latin words, but I will give you the translation. The translation is on the left, it means we hope for better things, and this sign right here which says it will rise from the ashes. So it's interesting when you still look at the flag of Detroit that they are using from this period, it reflects that fire in 1805. After the fire, Augustus Woodward had some very grandiose plans of how he wanted Detroit to look. He wanted it to almost resemble what was going on in Washington, D.C. at the time. He was influenced by the planning of our nation's capital at that time period. This is what he had envisioned it to be. This is not what it became. But if you're familiar with the city of Detroit, you'll see down here what's called Campus Martius. That is probably one of the things that results from Woodward's idea about what he wanted. Woodward had some other ideas, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, probably in May, about his vision for universal territorial education. So anyway, but that's not what it looked like. Okay, well, let's leave Detroit a little bit, and let's look at the fur trade. When Michigan became a territory, the fur trade is still going on. Maybe not at the speed and the amount of what it was going on in France, but it was still going on. And it was going on Mackinac Island. The fur trade, right before the War of 1812, about 3 years after we became a territory, Thomas Jefferson turned it over to John Jacob Astor and the American Fur Company. And under the law, only U.S. citizens could get licenses. And as I said, the center was on Mackinac Island. And we'll revisit this in just a little bit, because there's something that happens not long after Michigan becomes a territory, within 7 years. And that is the War of 1812. Now, as opposed to the French and Indian War, as opposed to the American Revolution, the War of 1812 did have a lot of action around the Detroit area, around Detroit, Lake Erie, and also up on Mackinac Island, around in that area. Now again, I could go through the reasons for the War of 1812, but I think you might remember the fact that we were dealing with Americans desiring more land, looking very enviously up in Canada. You had, again, Native American unrest going on there. You had trade issues, impressment of U.S. sailors. The United States was totally unprepared for the war. We had a very small Navy, a small adequate force of enlisted men and state militias, but you dealt also too with the problems of communication and the time that it took to get messages back and forth. You had the classic story of where negotiations were going on between the United States and Great Britain, but so you had a situation where Britain did what the United States wanted them to do, which was to revoke what was called the Orders of Council on June 16th, but America didn't know that, and they declared war 2 days later on June 18th. So you did have those problems in communication. You had a lot of support for the War of 1812 in areas like Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina. The areas that were not so much for it were New England and New York. Then you've got, here we go with William Hall again. William Hall, along with being the territorial governor, had also, as I said, fought in the American Revolution. And so he is put in charge of the army in Detroit and over this part of the Northwest. But you talk about miscommunication. So the United States declares war on June 18th. The British fort, Fort Malden, which was around Windsor, they knew about it. Hull did not know until July 2nd. So you're dealing about a 14-day difference in communication and time. One of the things that Hull was instructed to do was to invade Canada, which he did, but he left after 5 days. Now exactly, was it because he feared the amount of British soldiers that were there or the Native Americans, but he came back and Britain laid siege to Detroit. And what that resulted in, well, here we have a map of Detroit at that time period. You can see that the town is down here along the Detroit River in what was called Main Street, and the fort sat, what had been Fort Pontchartrain was no longer Fort Pontchartrain, but the fort actually sat up on a bluff from the city. So what you had is what was illustrated here in this drawing, where Hull, of course the British lay siege, Hull surrendered. It was either on August 12th or August 16th. So less than 2 months after war is declared, he surrenders Detroit. Now, for whatever reason, there were speculation as far as how many soldiers the British had, how many Native Americans they had. Hull was concerned about the people living in the Detroit area. I'm not sure, but what the distinction is this was the only time an American city was ever surrendered to a foreign enemy, back in August of 1812. Yes?
When did Hull invade Canada? What was the primary objective?
To take over Fort Malden.
Okay.
And try to get as much territory as you could, because if you also look at, and again, I'm not as well versed in the War of 1812 as other people are, but there was a big push to go into Canada and try to capture territory in Canada. Because as I said, one of the things that some people in the United States wanted was to get more land for the United States, and for that they went into Canada.
Yeah, sort of a recollection also. I think the Constitution, there's an element in there. This almost came up to maybe. I think Canada had some angst about us coming in and getting hold of their territory years and years after this. I think there's an element in our, I won't say Constitution, that says, kind of almost lends the thought that maybe we're interested in Canada, and when the opportunity arises, we're coming to get it. And I think there was a well, in the details of this, but I just thought that the War of 1812 was primarily because of them taking our pressing.
That was one of the reasons, the impressment of soldiers. Or sailors, not soldiers, but sailors.
And the economy.
Yeah, I think that was one thing too, but there are trade issues and also too, though, I think too, and that's why you had this big push, I think, from some regions, especially like, Kentucky and Tennessee, was for that. Yes?
With that in mind, do you think that also was because a lot of times a lot of those who were loyal to the crown ended up moving up to Canada after they were kind of found to be a bit outnumbered as the war began to move, and then basically just thought, well, we beat those guys once before, we can do it again?
Possibly. I'm not sure. I'm not sure on that. But so we have the and Great Britain also took over they conquered the fort up at Mackinac Island. So they had done that. So that's the way it was in August. And after that, you have the next year. Well, in January, if you see this map up here, you can see where Detroit was located as opposed to Fort Malden. And then you can see Frenchtown, which is Monroe. And so what you had happen in January of 1813, you had an American force that was coming up from the south to try to capture Detroit from the British. Meanwhile, the British were sending their soldiers down, and so there was the Battle of River Raisin. And the Raisin River is right there where Monroe is. And in that battle, unfortunately, the Americans were defeated, and there were hundreds of Americans that were either killed or taken prisoner. So by January of 1813, you're looking at a war that was only about 6 months old. Things didn't look all that good for the American force, but then you had some things happen, like you may remember this painting right here, which is September of 1813, when the British were defeated on Lake Erie by Oliver Hazard. So it took, let's see, this was August, this was September, so it took about 13 months for the American forces to gather together and show enough strength so that you have this battle on Lake Erie where the British are defeated, and through this battle, Detroit is liberated. So Detroit surrenders in August, and they are liberated by October of 1813. Also in 1813, you have the Battle of the Thames, which was a battle between the Americans and, again, unfortunately, the Native Americans, and this was over in Canada. And in that situation, the Native Americans were defeated. What that resulted in, okay, let's go back. What that resulted in was the Treaty of Ghent, December of 1814, where there was status quo. So, what happened to William Hull? William Hull was court-martialed, and there was one individual who was one of his colonels who wrote a very interesting piece. And in fact, one of the things that I had my students do, which was really interesting, is they read the piece written by William Hull, and then they read the piece written by this guy right here. This is Lewis Cass, who was one of Hull's colonels, lieutenant colonels, talking about the surrender of the fort in Detroit. And I wanted them to see which side that they agreed with. And that was a very interesting exercise to do. So Hull is court-martialed. He was not executed, but he did spend the rest of his life trying to clear his name and wrote at least 1 or 2 books justifying what he did in the surrender of the fort. In October of 1813, Cass is appointed military governor, and he is later territorial governor. And we'll talk about him in a little bit. So the war ends, and yes, it's the last time that there are battles fought on Michigan soil. It is the end of British hopes in regaining Michigan, and is now hoped that Michigan is now open for settlement for some families. Lewis Cass became our territorial governor for 18 years, between 1813 and 1831. He was born in New Hampshire, came to Ohio, made his way through Ohio. He was a lawyer, a state legislature, and then after he left Michigan, he had a very illustrious career in national government. Okay, so as I mentioned to you, we still had 3 smaller settlements, but let's go back to Mackinac Island. Now, obviously, this is not what it looked like during the fur trade, but it's the best that I could do as far as to get us in the mood of where we're going at this time. Mackinac Island is a great place to be. It's really crazy on Labor Day weekend, I can tell you that. That was the last time I was up there. So what you have with Mackinac Island, and these are a few of the buildings that are there, you've got the fort, and the fort was opened in 1781 and stayed open as an official U.S. fort until 1895. And you had, as I mentioned, the American Fur Company. The normal population at this time, after the War of 1812, the normal population on the island was about 500. But then during the summer, it went up to 2,000 at this time period because of the fur. Now, fur is still being brought to the island. They're looking at beaver, otter, muskrat, fox, mink, raccoon, a wide variety of that. We had 200 people up here that were employed by the American Fur Company. This is actually Market Street. This is not, if you go back to this picture, that is, of course, is the street that everybody goes down and gets your caramel corn and your fudge and all this kind of stuff. But if you go up the hill to Market Street, these are the buildings, well, with the exception of this building right here, because this is on that park area just down below from the fort. And you can walk by it. It doesn't look like this now. This was the last time I took pictures here. But some of these buildings right here, especially this one and this one, were owned by the American Fur Company and were used for the fur industry at that point in time. Now what's interesting is that during this time, right after the War of 1812, there were a number of women that were working as traders for the American Fur Company, including a woman by the name of Magdalene Laframboise, who's in Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. And the company was sold by 1834, and by the 1820s, maybe about 10 years after the War of 1812, the fur industry has changed tremendously. The fur industry is an example of an industry we have in Michigan called extractive, meaning they're taking things and they're not putting anything back like that. The other thing that was happening was the Industrial Revolution over on the eastern side of the United States was producing clothing at a cheaper rate than what you would do with fur. Fur was not fashionable anymore. And the other thing, too, is that they relied a lot on Native American labor, and a lot of the Native Americans were forced to move for reasons that we will get into, if not tonight, as I said, another. They tried commercial fishing, but it was never as big as the fur trade. Okay, so the fur trade, by this time, after the War of 1812, is beginning to decline a little bit. Okay. Well, it's also at this time, too, that Michigan has to deal with an image problem. After the War of 1812, the federal government decides to give land to the veterans of the War of 1812. And they decide to give land in Michigan to the veterans. Hooray! This is great. But it had to be surveyed. And so they put it in the hands of this guy down here, Edward Tiffin. Edward Tiffin was a surveyor general. Mainly, well, he was born in England, came to Virginia, lived in Ohio. He had been the speaker, he had been the governor, he had been the U.S. senator, and then, of course, became the surveyor general. The Tiffin report did not paint a pretty picture of Michigan, especially if you read this quote. This is a quote that you will see over and over again about their report about the land. And even the maps, I don't know if you can see this map here, but you can see that it shows the rivers of Michigan, but then it shows sort of like this no man's land right in here, which sort of mirrors that map we looked at last month that showed where areas where Native Americans did not live. And we were looking at that northern area of the northern part of the lower peninsula, that central area up there, which we decided last month was heavily wooded. But when you see something like this, there would be not more than 1 acre in 100. Okay? So when the federal government gets this, what do you think they do? Nope, sorry. Veterans of the War of 1812 are going to get land somewhere else, and it sure as heck is not Michigan. And so what Lewis Cass decides to do as a result of that is, because the federal government approved land in Illinois and Missouri, and Cass decides to do some things that a lot of people will do. If somehow somebody says something disparaging about your college, your university, your state, your city, you're going to do whatever you can to get the message across. So Lewis Cass wrote magazine articles, he sent letters, he had geographers come to Michigan, and the other thing that he did, and I wonder if I can have it here, let's go back. The other thing that Cass did is he decided to travel around the territory and collect as much information he had. He had a very large expedition. There were about 20 canoes that went around, had a number of people with him, and what they did is they went around the territory and they collected specimens like copper and flora and fauna and get other information about what things were like. But in Michigan, we have a transportation challenge. We have a transportation problem. Because when you look at where Michigan is located, it's not exactly straight in where, you know, where things can be. And so there's a challenge of how to get people to Michigan, because we were really not on the main westerly route. Now, in 1811, the federal government approved the funding of a national road from, originally it was from Cumberland, Maryland to Indiana. And federal funds were going to go into this, and this was going to be a military road. And you can see right here, this is such a great map, because it can tell you what was paid by federal money and what was built by private funds. I don't know the difference between that one and that one. Coloring might be different. But you can see it totally bypasses Michigan. And so when you look at, Ohio becomes a state in 1803, Indiana becomes a state in 1816, Illinois becomes a state in 1818. That road, I think, had a very, very big impact. So transportation is a problem. Okay, so let's get into the relations at this point in time with the Native Americans. I mentioned to you about the Treaty of Greenville, 1795. It said that this was probably the first, no, not probably, it was the first treaty between the United States government and the Native Americans in the Northwest. It started this period of treaties, as I said, for Native Americans to give up their land. One of the things that you see is they lumped different bands together. The treaties were negotiated and ratified by the Senate and signed by the U.S. Congress, or by the U.S. President, signed by the U.S. President. The idea of assembling, originally the federal government wanted these treaties to be negotiated in Washington, D.C. Whether it was not to try to get these individuals in awe of coming to a big city, practically that wasn't going to happen. You're not going to be able to do that. So they negotiated these treaties on site, but they were very large. There were hundreds and hundreds of people that were gathered together for something like this. The idea of the language barrier is the difference between the written and the spoken word. So many times in these treaties, the Native Americans accepted the spoken word, but then you'd have the federal government who would then either add things onto the treaty or in some way do the written, only concentrate on the written word. There were Native Americans that wanted to take advantage of whatever they would get from these treaties. And so sometimes they would be guaranteed permanent homes. Sometimes they would be promised skills, education, knowledge about agriculture. They would get promises for education as far as schooling goes, training to become blacksmiths, farmers. Of course, there were also a number of people who were not all in favor of these treaties because they did see this as a way of collapsing their way of life. If we look on a map here, okay, you might be able to see the one here on the left a little better than the one here on the right, but you can see the series of treaties that happened, especially in the teens and 20s and even 30s. The numbers of the amount of land, like for example, the Treaty of Saginaw right here, you had 119 million acres of land. The Treaty of Washington, which was up here, which was 15 million acres of land up here. So huge, huge amounts of expansive land. Interestingly enough, and I don't have it with me, I think I have it back in my folder, there are some of these treaties that are coming up now. And I don't know specifically if it's the Treaty of Washington. I think it was a revision of it later that dealt with, oh, I went too far, gotta learn how to, I thought I was doing so well, and I went too far. Okay, let's go back here. You might have read about the Odawa, the Little Traverse Band of Odawa Indians up here near Little Traverse Bay, around in this area. And their suit that they filed in federal court about a year ago to gain control of the land that was promised to them in a reservation, which included areas like Harbor Springs, Petoskey, 116, you know, the Avenue of the Trees. and that's going to be in court for a while, and that's up in this area. And so their suit doesn't go to the Treaty of Washington of 1836, but does go to, I think, a treaty that happened a little bit later after that. So you do read about these in other places, or even today. There were other policies that the federal government instituted in their relationship with the Native Americans, especially the Native Americans in the Northwest. The first one right here, not long after the War of 1812, was what was called the civilizing or the civilization policy, where the federal government at this time felt that the European culture was superior and they could be turned, that Native Americans could be turned into what you see here, Christian farmers who could read, write, and farm. So there was money that the federal government concentrated on this program, and what they would do is they would give it to mostly ministers to put this policy in place. And so they would give it to not only organizations, but they would also give it to missionaries in the area. And so it was their job to provide the education to do this. So that was one of the policies in 1819. The second policy was the removal policy. Now, these two might have been implemented, they might have been doing one rather than the other. I don't think it was a situation where the one policy ended and then they brought the other one on. They were talking about a removal policy even earlier, I think, than 1830. This was passed by Congress, and it was felt that this would be a way to save and protect the Native Americans by moving them out west. There was a shift in the attitude of, rather than having them exist with people, with the settlers that were coming in, that there was a feeling that it was actually to their benefit to actually physically remove them and send them out west. This was considered to be very progressive at that time. There's a wonderful illustration of an individual who took advantage of these policies to the benefit of him and to the benefit of his tribe that he was working with. This is Leopold Pokagon. He was Ojibwe, but he was adopted by the Potawatomi. And one of the things that he did with the annuities that his group received from these treaties, instead of spending them on various things, he decided to spend it on land. And so by 1838, near Dowagiac, he had purchased 874 acres of land that he was able to rightly own. And when that removal policy came in, I should say that it was originally introduced in 1830. Later on, it was really put into force by 1835. Pokagon decided to go to court. Because the other thing that Pokagon did is he took advantage of the civilizing policy and gathered whatever information, whatever knowledge that they could get from it. I'm not saying it was perfect, but he did do that. He took his case to court and said that he and his clan, his band, I think it's a band, should not be removed because they were tax-paying Christian farmers. And the court agreed with them. The Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians is named specifically for Leopold Pokagon and what he did. It is estimated that, at least in southwestern Michigan, western Michigan, there were about 1,500 Pokagons that moved to the west. Now, there were a number that came back to Michigan. As far as what some of the other groups did, the Ojibwe in the Upper Peninsula, I think that for them, they were further enough north that I don't think that there was no forcible removal for them. The Odawa tried to take a tactic, and the thing that they did, attempted to do, which appeared in the second Constitution, they pushed for the Native Americans to be able to get the right to vote, because they thought that if they could get the right to vote, they could prevent a removal from happening. So there were different groups that tried to do what they could to fight the removal. There were many that could not do anything. If you go into the train station, there is a marker that talk about when the number of Potawatomis were marched through Kalamazoo and sent out west. So it is a part of our history. Now, whether or not Alfonso Iannelli used that specific reason for this, it's up to artistic interpretation. But I do think that his general theme of the settler pushing the Native American to the west, if it was not a reflection of the removal policy of the 19th century, was a general statement that he was making about the relationship between the settlers and the Native Americans. Okay. Another thing was the land had to be surveyed. And so what the Territory did is they started the survey work once they got control of the various pieces of property. And they established the baseline, and the baseline is the northern boundary of the second tier of counties. When you think of, so like the northern boundary of Kalamazoo County would be considered the baseline. If you carry that baseline all the way to the east, maybe not technically here, but 8 Mile is the baseline over Detroit. I don't think it really follows well on this one. The prime meridian, or the principal meridian, as you can see here, starts at the Sioux and goes to the south. And that's how they surveyed the property. I know that I always like to say that if you're at East Lansing, just adjacent to East Lansing is Meridian Township. So you can tell there where that is. And so everything is, as I said, based here. This is the description of my property. So it's the northwest corner of the southwest quarter, the section 27. It's the second township south and the 11th west of the meridian. So it's very interesting when you see that. The survey itself, there were three, let's see, the surveyors were paid $3 for every mile. The main surveyors were names that might sound familiar. Sylvester Higgins, William Burt, and John Mullet. And if you know your lakes up in the northern part of the Lower Peninsula, all three of them have lakes named after that. So we've got Burt Lake, Mullet Lake, and Higgins Lake, which is adjacent to Houghton Lake. It took 36 years to survey this state between 1815 and 1851. Okay, so transportation. Well, first before transportation, names of the counties. There's actually a geography class that you can take at Western, Geography of Michigan. And one of the things that they have you do is they have you memorize all of the county names. When you look at the county names, you will see that there's not a general theme. Yes, we do have ones that are named Native American in some way. Kalamazoo is an example of a Native American Potawatomi name. We do have some that are French derivation. We've got a number of them named after Andrew Jackson and Andrew Jackson's cabinet. So when you look at especially the counties that are located in the southern part of the Lower Peninsula, when you have things like Calhoun County and Jackson County, Van Buren County, named for Martin Van Buren, around in that area. Then you got this guy right here. This is Henry Schoolcraft. Henry Schoolcraft, among many other things, was I think he was involved with geology. He was a scientist. He also became the Native American agent up at the Sioux. And one of the things he did was he created some of the names of our counties, and he tried, it just was a combination of what he perceived to be Native American words and Latin words and make these things together. So like Allegan is one that he created. So there are a number of county names that he pulled together. Okay, so internal improvements. Well, one of the things is we've got roads. We had both military roads and we had territorial roads that were started. So, for example, the main territorial road was right here. We know that as I-94. So it went from Detroit all the way over to St. Joe. You can see another view of it down here. would be a territorial road, funded by the territory in some way. Now, we did have military roads. The main military road was this one that went from Detroit all the way over to Fort Dearborn in Chicago. Now, up here you can see the different variations of the numbers when they started numbering these roads in the 1920s. So what we know as I-94 for many years was known as US 12 before the interstate came in. The military road is the old Sauk Road, which is now US 12, which used to be US 112, which follows the pattern of those Native American trails that we saw last month, the old Sauk Trail. So some of our early roads used those as a way of planning these roads out. There were other roads that were planned. You see one here that went from Detroit to Grand Rapids. But keep in mind how rough these roads were. They were very, very rough. I mean, literally, they'd cut the tree down, keep the logs in the road, and hold on to your hats, because it was going to be a bumpy ride. So they did do something as far as roads go. Now, what about trains? Okay. There was attempts to have trains in this early territorial period. Probably the one that we read about the most is the Erie and Kalamazoo. This is an illustration. There's a couple other illustrations of the Erie and Kalamazoo. But keep in mind that they were actually sort of like stub lines that were to connect from one river to another. They were to link rivers. They weren't really anything like what we would think of as far as train travel. And trains really pick up after we become a state. Water transportation. We have the steamboat here, which is called Walk in the Water, and that was really big. Here you have the Erie and Canal, the Erie and Kalamazoo Railroad, which was to link Toledo, and it was supposed to go all the way up to like Hillsdale, Lenawee, up to Adrian, around in that area, so nothing really big. But the one thing that had the biggest impact on the settlement of Michigan was something that didn't happen in Michigan. It happened in New York, and that was the Erie Canal. Governor DeWitt Clinton wanted to link Lake Erie to the Hudson River and then to eventually to the Atlantic Ocean. Canals were the big thing back then. Not railroads, but canals. So Clinton raised $7 million from British investors. And it began in 1817. Now, it's 363 miles. It took from 1817 to 1825 to complete. It took 8 years to complete it. 363 miles. The channel was 28 inches wide at the bottom, 40 inches wide at the depth, or 40 inches wide at the top. It had a depth of about 4 feet. There were 83 locks that would either raise or lower the boat to get through. And it cut the time to get from New York would be down here, but it cut the time to get from Buffalo to New York from 20 days to 6 days. Yes?
Don't you mean feet?
I have inches. Feet's probably right. I think you're right. 20 inches would be too short. I'm going to have to change my notes. Thank you very much for that. I'm glad you didn't fall asleep. I'm glad I didn't put you to sleep. Yes, or talking feet. All right, and here we have an illustration of the boat on the Erie Canal. You can see that how they were propelled was from mules that would pull the boat a certain period of miles, and then you get a new crew that would come on. And they employed young boys to bring those animals by. Now, speed was not of an essence because of the time that it would take. And the canal boats ran about 4 miles an hour. They ran 7 days a week, which caused a huge controversy because they ran on Sundays. There were packet boats that could carry 100 people. And the first year alone, 40,000 people took this way west. Okay. Well, when you look at it, the National Road may have missed us, but the Erie Canal did not. Because you take the Erie Canal, you get on a boat to Buffalo, and you're going to go to Detroit. It had an impact in the cost of shipping. Previously, before the canal, it cost between $90 to $125 a ton to ship. Within 10 years, it cost $4 a ton to ship. And it made New York the #1 national port because of what came through here. All right, so the Erie Canal. So here we have some other illustrations of the Erie Canal. I think this one is unreal. Look at the series of those locks. I don't know where that was exactly. Here you have...
Do you know the town?
I do not know the town. I can find that out, but I do not know the town. And here we have some individuals who are enjoying their time. Of course, you had to be very careful if you came to a bridge. You want to get off the top there. So, let's go back a second here. So, when you look at the impact that this had in Michigan, again, let's look at the population. Population of the territory in 1820, you've got it right there. Okay? The Erie Canal opens up 5 years later. Look at where the population is there. Look what happens then by 1840. Okay? This is the time period of the pioneers, and this was the last book I brought with me that I think is really great about this, because when you look at this time period, the majority of the people that came to Michigan came from New York and New England. And they came because they wanted farmland, and we had fertile farmland. Transportation was not a challenge. You rode that Erie Canal. And it's just incredible when you look at the Michigan fever that happened here. 1824, right around this time, 1824, 62,000 acres was sold in Michigan. By 1826, 1.5 million acres was sold in the territory of Michigan. Brian Wilson, who is on the staff of Western Michigan University in the religion department, wrote a book called Yankees in Michigan. It's part of the Discovering the Peoples of Michigan series that comes out by Michigan State. This was outstanding in talking about these people, the Yankees who came to Michigan, especially from New England, because of what they had here and the advantages that they had here. There are 74 Michigan towns that bear the name of New York cities. Rochester, Genesee. We also have New Boston. We have Vermontville in Michigan. The majority came from this area. They came primarily because of the soil that we had. We had the largest increase of any state or territory at this time period. Now, Brian Wilson, W-I-L-S-O-N. And it was interesting because this series looks at ethnic groups in Michigan. And to see this one on Yankees in Michigan, you have to think about, how is this considered an ethnic group? And the reason why Wilson does that is he says that an ethnic group is a group that has a shared culture and a sense of identity based on religion, race, or nationality. And for the Yankees in Michigan, it was definitely religion for something like that. But New England, by 1850 in Michigan, 41% of the population in Michigan based their heritage on New England. Now, this doesn't mean that we have a number of people from New York that are also coming here too. Now, we also have a number of European migration that's coming in at this time. We have a number of Germans that are coming in that are settling in such areas as Ann Arbor, Frankenmuth. There's some other cities around there that Frankenmuth, Frankentrost, Frankenhill, Westphalia, where my ancestors came at this time period. But the impact of the Erie Canal was huge when you look at these people. Here's the land sales. Okay. Why? I mentioned to you that the people from New England were looked upon as being industrious. Now, how did they do this? They you know, they, 3 ways that they came. Now here we have, you can see the settlement, patterns of sales, or land sales. And so initially, a lot of the early land was sold down here in the southern lower peninsula, around in that area. And then as the years went on, it got further north. But those initial years, they're all settling around here. They're landing in Detroit and then moving west to various areas. So the reason why, we just talked about this. Why did they come and where did they come from? There was an interest to attract people from New England for a lot of different reasons, and one of these are these things here. They were considered to be very educated, very religious, family was important, and also work. Now, one of the things that Brian Wilson talks about are the ways that they came. And this was really interesting. The colonization companies. Those are where, like we talked about the Ohio company, where you have a company that will come in and buy land and then divide it up amongst people. And so when we look at, for example, Prairie Ron, Schoolcraft, Bennington, Dexter, Mapleton, those were started as colonization companies. Covenanted companies, where you had church congregations that moved together. Romeo, Vermontville, Frankenmuth. Of course, we can also say Holland. It's the same thing, other
Not
than
the place east of Kalamazoo.
which place?
Gets an A. The other side of
Elmo?
this side of Galesburg.
Augusta?
No, it's now a county park.
Okay, we'll have to think about that before we leave tonight. So you had that. And then the chain migration, what the chain migration is when people write letters and then they send them to their families and say, hey, this is a great land of milk and honey. Come and join us. So Wilson really capsulizes 3 ways that people came here to Michigan. Where those people came from, New York and New England, impacted our local government, because one of the things that we adopted in Michigan was the town. We both have townships and we have counties. So you can see here where the township comes from and what they were responsible for initially. So we're looking at, as I said to you, remember we talked about the sale of Section 16 would go to the township, and the townships initially were in charge of the schools. And so you see that in some of the things that they were doing. And with the county, the role of the county, there we see the impact of the people that came here from New York and what they are responsible for, the elections, certainly roads, public safety, the sheriff, keeping records, birth, deaths, and marriages. I mean, that comes from the county. And so we can look at that. So that is where we are going to end it tonight. I thought that we were going to get to statehood, but we will have to pick that up next month in May, because when I do say the very long road to statehood, I am being correct. So we will pick that up and get to Michigan where it becomes a state, and then we'll talk a little bit about what Michigan was like after statehood. Does anybody have any questions this evening? Yes, sir.
I'm sure you're aware of this, but for the benefit of the audience, there was a canal started north of Detroit. We're going to go across the state with that canal.
Yes, and we're going to talk about it next week next month in May when we talk about internal improvements, the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal.
The second thing I wanted to add was we have a farm west of Kalamazoo. And years ago, I did research on the property. And it was obvious doing that research that in about the 1820s, 1830s, that land was bought and sold a number of times. And I remember when I was doing the research, of course, I had no idea what was going on, so I had to guess. But it appeared, and all the people were deep from the east. Mm-hmm. And it looked to me like one would come and buy so many acres and then sell it to another guy, and every time the price went up, it was like a land rush, and you were selling land to one another as time went on.
They called it Michigan fever at that point in time period. Yes?
And that slide about your baseline you had, where I think it's 8 Mile coming out of Detroit.
Yeah, that's why I'm thinking that map may not have been accurate.
Well, actually, the baseline comes over it. You got, I don't know, took a class just recently on this, but John Geisler out here out western, he talked about the Sauk Trail. That baseline comes over, and then goes straight north a little bit, then it goes west. And it jogged, there was an error in making it. So that's just a, you know,
Well, the survey, there's also a story about how Battle Creek got its name. Because during the survey, I think Mullet's crew was there, and there was a little scuffle between the surveyors and the survey crew and the Native Americans who were there because they didn't understand what was going on at that time period. And that's how Battle Creek got its name, because it happened at a creek. I don't know what kind of battle it was, but sometimes those names are interesting. Anybody else have any questions?
When was the Toledo War and the dispute over the script and all that?
We will get into that. That gets into 1835,
Yeah.
around in that area. So we'll talk about that. When I say the long road to statehood, that will certainly include that. Yes?
How do you account for the discrepancy of the original guy that came here and said, "Oh, you're not going to be able to farm any of this land or anything," and then later in the early 1800s, when of course they could?
Well, I think it was because of the spot that they were surveying. And the survey crew at that time for Edward Tippin was looking in an area around, I don't know if it was Adrian or southern lower Michigan, that was called the Black Swamp. So they really didn't look beyond that, and whether or not it was because of transportation problems and getting to the place or not, I'm not really too sure. If they had gone further to the west, they would have, because when you look at Kalamazoo County, you talk about the prairies of Kalamazoo County being ideal farmland in that stage. So I don't know if they wanted to look any further. Was politics involved? Oh, I think so. I think so, very much so. All right, yes?
East of Albion, Michigan, on old US 12, there's a stone, Territorial Road. That's where I was
You need to
born.
apply for a library card.
I don't know what it says right now.
On the first floor now.
Well, it's just like, if you will come upon it, sometimes if you're driving along the road, and you'll come by bypass and you'll look at it, it'll say Territorial Road.
Oh, yeah.
If you go to Battle Creek and you're driving near the airport, there's Territorial Road. So I don't know if anybody's ever traced the old Territorial Road, but it's interesting when you see bits and pieces of the names somewhere. Well, we got our first warning. So anyway, thank you very, very much, and I will see you in May, hopefully on a warmer night.